Okay, chapter 14, beginning at verse 14. Then I looked, St. John says, and behold, a white cloud, and seated on the cloud, one like a son of man, with a golden crown on his head and a sharp sickle in his hand. And another angel came out of the temple, calling with a loud voice to him who sat on the cloud, Put in your sickle and reap, for the hour to reap has come, for the harvest of the earth is fully ripe. So he who sat on the cloud swung his sickle across the earth, and the earth was reaped. Now just stop right there. That is a picture of an ingathering. Now you don't have to go very far or think very hard, let's say it that way, to see the symbolism in this. First of all, what is going on? The first clue that you have is that, what does he say? Put in your sickle. So a sickle, that's your first clue. And then he says reap. Okay, so we've got harvest time. Harvest time is coming. The first thing that we should really roll forward in our mind is the gospel message. We have the parables. Think of the parables. There's a number of them that relate to harvest. But think about the parable of the wheat and the tares. That's a very important parable. And I argue that what you have here is a rolling forward of that parable. Now, what happens here? You know the story. If you go back to the parable, you have the enemy who comes in and plants the tares, which is a weed that looks amazingly like wheat. He plants it in the field. Everything grows up. The servants come to the master being Jesus, of course, and they say, well, look, there's weeds. Somebody sowed these tares in your field. You want us to go get it? And he says, no, because you might accidentally pull up the wheat as well. Let's wait till the harvest. Now, Jesus then has to explain this parable, and you know this. And what he does is he says he sends the angels to reap this harvest. So what you're seeing here is this rolling forward of that parable. So he uses the term sickle because that is a tool that is used in the wheat harvest. And so he's reaping, and what happens? The earth is reaped. Now, I put forth to you that, if you just thought that, you wouldn't necessarily know what to think. But it's not a verse that stands alone. And so when we go to the next verse, it says, another angel came out of the temple. He too had a sharp sickle. Another angel came out from the altar. It gets difficult with all these angels coming from different places. He comes out from the altar, and the angel who has authority over the fire, and he called with a loud voice to the one who has the sickle. So one angel is speaking to another, and what does he say? Put in your sickle, gather the clusters from the vine of the earth, for its grapes are ripe. Now, stop right there. Now, there are two harvests. I don't know how to say plural harvest. There's more than one harvest going on here. So my argument to you is that the first verses 14 to 16, those three verses, they refer to the redeemed. That this would be the harvest of the wheat, if you will, to follow the metaphor. And so I would say that's an ingathering. And so that's a picture. How did the 144,000 join the Lamb on Mount Zion and in heaven, right? Because remember, it was all blurred together. And I try to make the argument, whether I did a good job or not, that idea there in chapter 14, verse 1 through 5 was very similar and a rolling forward of Exodus 24, where the 70 elders come up and they look and they see into the throne room of heaven on the top of Mount Sinai. God opens the veil, and the throne room is as if it's on the top of Mount Sinai. Exodus 24. Remember, I labored in that field to try to say that Exodus 24 was rolled forward to Revelation chapter 4, if you'll recall. Well, something like that is going on in chapter 14, verse 1 through 5, because they're there on Mount Zion, which is Any place that God dwells is a temple. The presence of God is a temple. And He's there, and you hear this singing coming from heaven. It's only the redeemed who are singing it, and so there's a sense in which there is an opening of the veil. And it's when you read 14:1 through 5, it's hard for you to know, are they in Mount Zion? Are they in the throne room? And the answer is yes. It's kind of like the same place. It's a really cool thing. Very much like Exodus 24. So how did the 144,000 get there? The angels reap the harvest to fulfill, if you will, the language of the parable of the wheat and the tares. But it doesn't end there. And what's really strange, and I just read to you, this idea, the other angel has a sickle. But what is he doing? Now this is a mixing of metaphors if I've ever heard one. Now why do I say that? He has a sickle. What kind of harvest do you do with a sickle? You do wheat. And yet, he's told, put in your sickle, gather the clusters from the vine of the earth. Now, a sickle is not something that you would normally use. Now, it may be that you had a small one, that, you could just cut, because, you cut the grapes off more like this, as opposed to, on a long stick where you're cutting the wheat, right? So it's a bit of a different tool, okay? Because what he's cutting is the grape clusters. So now, but there's a reason why he changes the metaphor. Because, as you see, and I stopped, but when you get to 19, it says, so the angel swung his sickle across the earth, gathered the grape harvest of the earth, and threw it into the great winepress of the wrath of God. And so, what you see there is the Old Testament metaphor of God's wrath. Winepress is a shorthand way of speaking of the day of the Lord and God's wrath. And so, what you have, in this, let's say verses 17 through 20, is a wrath of the Lamb, where you're seeing really the wicked are brought together. And then in verse 20 you have this, it's an Armageddon picture. The winepress is trodden, and blood flowed from the winepress as high as a horse's bridle for 1,600 stadia, roughly 200 miles. So that's a picture of Armageddon and the wrath of the Lamb. It's a bloodbath, we would say. The wicked die. It's another way of expressing the third angel's message in verse 9 through 11. It's a brutal picture. So they're all gathered, they're all killed. Okay, now what I want us to do is let's kind of switch gears and move forward a bit. Go to chapter 17, sorry. We've talked about chapters 15 and 16 because that's where you have the 7 plagues, which are the 7 bowls. And that's a cycle. Remember, we had the 3 cycles. So we've already talked about that. And what we're doing right now is we're looking at the various interludes. Remember, an interlude is backstory. The cycles, they give you a framework to hang this book on. We have the seals, we have the trumpets, and we have the bowls. And they all have similar things going on inside of them. Now, what's going on is they each have at least one interlude, and now we're in the interlude for the cycle of the bowls or plagues. And so we get to chapter 17, and we have a very interesting turn of affairs or events, because then it says, one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came and said to me, come, I will show you the judgment of the great prostitute who was seated on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth have committed sexual immorality, and with the wine of whose sexual immorality the dwellers on earth have become drunk. And he carried me away in the Spirit, that's verse 3, into a wilderness. And I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was full of blasphemous names, had 7 heads, 10 horns. Sounds familiar. The woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet, and adorned with gold and jewels and pearls, holding in her hand a golden cup full of abominations and the impurities of her sexual immorality. And on her forehead was written a name of mystery, Babylon the Great, mother of prostitutes and of earth's abominations. And I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints, the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. We'll just stop right there. Very, very interesting. Now, a reflection I want you to make here is that what you have in chapter 17 and 18 is something that at first doesn't quite meet the eye. So I will encourage you, let's before we talk about this, let's go to the end of chapter 17. And what you'll find there, just all the way back at verse 18, the very last verse, it says, and this is an angel is filling in St. John, and he says, "And the woman that you saw is the great city that has dominion over the kings of the earth." Now, I tell you, that's not a throwaway line. It's very important, but maybe not necessarily for the reasons that you think. Now, the first thing I would have you do is think about this idea of the city of man versus the city of God. Now, this is Augustine's magnum opus, the city of God. And he pictures this conflict between, man and his pride. It's just like Cain, for example. What does Cain do after he's slain his brother and he's gone off? What happens? Well, he goes out, he has a son, he builds a city, and he names it after his son. Well, that's highly significant because it speaks of pride. The firstborn is a very important concept in the biblical way of thinking, because it speaks of your strength and your power. Which is why, of course, the 10th plague is so important. It's not because of anything other than what God was saying is, I'm God, you aren't God, I'm taking your firstborn and you can't stop me. In other words, he took Pharaoh's strength. He belittled Pharaoh, who was a son of the gods, like a godlike figure in their way of thinking. So what's going on is you're having this story of Cain rolled forward, but even better, I would argue, is the story of the Tower of Babel. Babel and Babylon are the same. And what you have in this story is, in verse 5 said it, the name of mystery written on her forehead, Babylon the Great. And so there is a connection, a very clear connection between Babel, the Tower of Babel, and Babylon. Because you know the story, in the Tower of Babel, there was one language and all the people were together. They knew, the ancients were very intelligent. Don't underplay them. They weren't building a ziggurat that would actually get them to heaven. They knew that wasn't the case. But they're making a name for themselves, and they are really what they're doing is they're exhibiting pride. And God observes that if we let them go on, there's nothing that they won't be able to do. Now, obviously, he's speaking hyperbolically because they couldn't create the world, obviously, but they will accomplish great things, and it will be to their detriment because it's called hubris. It'll lead to their own destruction. So God did what? He confused their languages and he scattered them around the earth. Well, what is going on here? Well, look closely at verse 1. So we have this great prostitute who is seated on many waters. Now at first blush, that makes no sense. Well, the Bible actually helps us out with that. Well, let's go back and figure out, well, when you go back to the end of chapter 17, but now verse 15 this time, the angel says to St. John, the waters that you saw, where the prostitute is seated, are peoples and multitudes and nations and languages. In other words, the woman with Babylon the Great written on her forehead is sitting over all of the people. Just like at Babel. You can see the parallels very clearly. All the people are at Babel, they have one language. Here, they have different languages, but they're still unified. They're all unified in their goal of what? Of making a name for themselves, of building this world system. That's why the second angel said, Babylon is fallen, was very important. Because it was saying, it was just what God did to Babel back in the day, God is doing and is going to do to Babel today. For the here, this is in the present, right? So this is a very important concept, that what we have is a rolling forward of the Tower of Babel here. But that's not all. But we'll leave that for the next section.